everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. It's Monday, May 22nd, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. Now, I'm super excited about our guest this week because I got to talk to Dr. Richard Prum, and I got to talk to him in person in studio, which is always a ton of fun. But before I intro him and get into that, I want to thank those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible this week. I know I say it week after week, but I think it bears repeating. I need you guys, and you are so incredibly important, and you really make Talk Nerdy possible. And that's because I share the show for free. It's 100% free to download each and every week. Now, I am Talk Nerdy. I produce every episode. I do all of my own booking. I do all of my editing and uploading and writing the metadata. And of course, I do all the interviews for the show. I don't have any assistants on it. So in order to afford the equipment and the hosting and the time that it takes to do this, I really rely on you guys for support. Now, the best way to support the show is honestly through Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/talknerdy, you can pledge your support in any amount. This week's big supporters through Patreon are Phil T-Bear, Timothy Glover, Jonathan Wright, Christian Jeffrey, David Lacey, Jeffrey Perez, Stuart Ogue, The Honorable Husband, Jafe, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell, among many, many, many of you who pledge in smaller amounts each week. It's because of you, really, that this podcast stays on the air. There's also a few of you who like to pledge your support through the PayPal button that you can find on my website at carasantamaria.com. And this week, our big supporter was Rob Schreck. So I want to thank you very much as well. Now, there are other ways you can support the show, and they don't have to be financial. You can rate and review on iTunes or the Android app that you use. You can share the show through your social media channels and let your friends and family know about it, because the more listeners I get, the easier it is for me to sell ads, the easier it is for me to up my my listenership through these different outlets. And the more that, you know, the individual people who can afford to support the show can offset it for those of you who can't, because the whole point of it being free is that for most people, it's still free. And I just really appreciate all of you who listen each and every week, and those of you who are able to support the show in the ways that you do. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my online store. I'm trying to be better about promoting it, but there I have some super cool Talk Nerdy t-shirts, some stickers and buttons, some handmade leather goods by Foster Leather Works, like these cool keychain fobs and bookmarks that say Talk Nerdy. I've also got slap bracelets in case you want to feel like it's the 90s again. I've got signed copies of Charlie and the Tortoise, both by the author, MJ Mouton, and by myself. I wrote the foreword to the book. And what else? I've got some new mugs coming. There aren't any in the store right now, but the artist H.P. Bloomer is making me a new batch as we speak. Okay. Enough business. Let's dive into the show. So Richard Prum is an ornithologist. He is actually the director of the Frank Program in Science and the Humanities, which is an initiative at Yale that fosters communication, mutual understanding, collaborative research, and teaching amongst a bunch of different scientific and humanities disciplines. But he's also the curator of ornithology and the head curator of vertebrate zoology at the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. So, you know, he's a bird researcher, but also has done a lot of paleontology through that. And he has a new book that's just fascinating. It's called The Evolution of Beauty: How Darwin's Forgotten Theory of Mate Choice Shapes the Animal World and Us. So we're going to dive deep into disrupting evolutionary biologists' most dearly held beliefs, as well as a little bit of feminist biology. Guys, this is a really good show. I'm very excited about it. So without any further ado, here he is, Rick Prum. Well, Rick, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I am thrilled to talk about your new book, The Evolution of Beauty, How Darwin's Forgotten Theory of Mate Choice Shapes the Animal World and Us. I'm excited because I received a copy a few weeks ago and I've been looking through it, and it's beautiful, first of all. I'm also excited because Ed Yong, who is an incredible science writer, I mentioned him often on the show, did a wonderful piece in The Atlantic about it recently.
Yeah, it was exciting to have somebody read the book and get it.
Yeah, and he really did. It felt like, as I was reading it, he really got it.
He got it. I think he has a good awareness of where mainstream thought is in evolutionary biology. And so he's really prepared to understand what I was trying to do in the book.
For sure. And sometimes science writers run up against some difficulty. I've interviewed many science writers, some who are pure science journalists or science communicators who have simply a background in journo or in English literature or something, and then scientists who also write popular science books. You are obviously in that category, who will tell me after an interview like, oh, it was really fun talking to another person that's kind of in it with me, because you often find yourself, as you probably know now that you're touring for the book, talking to journalists or people who do coverage who never think about this stuff and are coming at it with like very little background knowledge.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things for me about the book is it's not just a report from the field. It's not just coming down and trying to bring standard science or the current science to the people. I'm really doing some work in the book. There's a lot of new science in the book. And so it's an act of science. And I'm trying to make it science for the people, for a broad audience, but also to reach my professional colleagues or to reach other people in the field. So that's a hard sweet spot to get both
absolutely
the public and my colleagues. So I want to write a book that the public will want to read and that my colleagues will have to read.
And that's really cool that it offers us that crossover, because oftentimes as science reporters, they're tasked with going out in the field, doing a lot of reporting. That's the definition of reporting, right? Calling up scientists, visiting them in their labs, asking a million questions so that they can piece together this beautiful story. You got to do some self-reporting and really look into your lab notebooks and share new stories of discovery. So let's talk about that first before we really even dive into the book. You are at Yale and you're the curator of ornithology and the head curator of vertebrate zoology. Is that correct?
Yes. So among the things I do, I'm managing and running a scientific collection of bird specimens, as well as vertebrates in general at the Yale Peabody Museum.
That's so cool. And is the Yale Peabody Museum on the Yale campus?
Yes, and that's actually essential because we're a part of undergraduate education, a part of graduate and undergraduate research. So that keeps us vitally connected to the university.
Very cool. So as a quick aside, one of my colleagues, I work on another podcast called The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And one of my colleagues, Stephen Novella, is a neurologist at Yale. So I'm sure you could wave to him from across campus, but you are in very different departments.
I've actually done a Skeptic's Guide.
No, you haven't.
I have. It was quite a few years ago on the origin of birds, on the theropod dinosaur origin of birds, which is some of my research is really related to.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that was good fun.
So you know each other. Yeah, so I just joined them like about 3 years ago, so it must have been just before I joined. We should have you back on and we can talk about this. That'd be great. So the cool thing is, of course, that if you work in ornithology and you work in collections, there's a huge crossover, as you just mentioned, between birds and dinosaurs, because in essence, birds are the continued evolution of a specific lineage of dinosaurs.
Yeah, birds are dinosaurs in the same way that humans are mammals, right? They're just you don't just come from mammals. You're always a mammal once you're a mammal, right? You don't become unmammal. And so in that sense, the birds are not descended from dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs. They're around us, more than 10,000 species around the planet. We're surrounded by dinosaurs all over wherever we go.
That's such a good way to put it.
And that's a fascinating. It's a marvelous thing to inform the science and our awareness of the world.
Absolutely. And when I look out my window here in Los Angeles near Griffith Park, I see all sorts of dinosaurs. You, I know because I was just at Steve's house this past weekend. I just flew in from Connecticut. He's a bird watcher. His kids are bird watchers. And out there in Connecticut, so many beautiful birds to just learn from, to observe. And of course, here in my office, I don't know if you noticed looking around, but I have a massive collection of the other kind of bird, the dinosaurian bird, some of which are in that direct bird lineage, that avian lineage, many of which are not.
I thought my kids had the biggest collection of rubber dinosaurs in the world, but that's a pretty good one.
I'm a grown-up kid. And so you've actually done some research, some very, I think, groundbreaking research within this paleontological field, even though you wouldn't call yourself a paleontologist, right?
Right. I'm definitely a living bird biologist, but my role in that whole debate has been on the origin of feathers. So really starting from teaching ornithology, I became very interested in feather biology and how feathers grow and their colors, etc. And so based on how feathers grow, I came up in the late 90s with a crackpot theory of how they evolved, and that was part of my ornithology notes. And then suddenly in '98, a bunch of these feathered dinosaurs started being discovered in China, and there was really no understanding how these structures could be related to feathers. And suddenly I realized that lingering in my ornithology class notes was a new theory of the origin of feathers. So I polished it up and published it, and that became really part of the resolution of the theropod origin of birds. Really, I think the feather angle, the fact that feathers evolved in bipedal meat-eating dinosaurs prior to the origin of birds and prior to the origin of flight, really sealed the deal on the fact that birds are dinosaurs.
Absolutely. I just covered on Skeptic's Guide, I do a segment called What's the Word? And my word just a couple of weeks ago was exaptation. And we used that very specific example of feathered dinosaurs possibly possessing feathers for temperature regulation or for mating ritual or whatever. And then eventually, it was co-opted, I guess you could say, for flight. But evolution don't have no purpose. There was no decision that was made ahead of time when it comes to evolution, which we will be getting to. And of course, I have to just share that I have Archaeopteryx tattooed on my forearm.
That's the Berlin specimen.
This is the Berlin specimen.
Yeah, thanks.
Good eye. So that's so cool. So you've worked with feather evolution, even pigmentation in feathers?
Sure. I've been really interested in both pigments, but especially structural colors, those colors that are optical. So if you look at a bluebird or a blue jay or a parrot, those greenish and bluish colors are produced by optical interactions of ambient light with nanostructures in the feathers.
Much like many butterflies.
Sure. And so we've been very interested in how that works, the optics, the development of biology. How do you develop nanotechnology at the right size scale and the appropriate shape to make the appropriate colors? And so that's been a very consuming part of my work.
Isn't it great how nature has done such profound engineering that we're still just trying to mimic that in all of our materials?
Well, actually, there's a couple of labs in the world that are working on the next generation sort of color Kindle, a reflective electronic screen that does not produce light but reflects light in color. And the hottest leads are all in biomimetic bluebird feather style optical structures.
So cool.
So caring about blue, actually, who knew that it might lead to the next electronic paper technology?
Seriously,
but that's where the research is going right now.
Oh, that's so cool. And who knew, honestly, like you knew, but probably I didn't know, and many of the people listening didn't know that the blue of a blue jay really is a structural or an optical blue and not just a pigment in a melanocyte underneath that feather. So right. I learned something new just now. Thank you. That's why I love doing this show. So you've obviously done some research that's incredibly significant to paleontology because of that comparative, I guess you could say, anatomy that we see oftentimes. When I took a paleontology course in college, half of it was comparative vertebrate anatomy. We looked at extant species to understand these extinct species. And so obviously that's something that's been going on for quite a while. And I know that there is a whole sort of movement or a whole school in paleontology, like the Neil Shubin school. I'm not sure if that's the Harvard school where he went, or maybe it was Yale, where it's comparative vertebrate anatomy instead of the typical, I guess, geology pathway.
And one of the interesting things about that tradition from Shubin is that it combines developmental biology with phylogenetics, informed by the unique additional information you get from paleontology and from stratigraphy, right? So those are powerful tools. And actually the feather work was really at the same nexus of developmental biology. How does the development of feathers inform how they might have evolved, right? So that's really very much in this Evo area of evolutionary biology and paleontology.
And it's so necessary. You know, I think one of the themes in your book that I guess we're going to transition and dive into this, one of the themes is that historically the story of science and the movements within science have been kind of singularly focused. They've ignored much context. Yeah. And sometimes when we ignore context, let's say we look at evolution without thinking about development, or we look at evolution only looking at the male of the species, for example, we're missing such an important part of the picture. And I think that you make a case for that beautifully in your book about beauty. But before we get into that, why don't we talk about kind of the core thesis of the book, which really comes down to mate selection and sort of a new, maybe irreverent, not completely accepted within the evolutionary biology community, a way of looking at this.
Right. So the mainstream idea about sexual ornament in nature is that mating preferences evolve because they provide useful information that choosers need to know.
Okay.
The idea here is that the peacock's tail or other kind of sexual ornaments in nature encode practical information about mate quality. And it could come in two forms: good genes, like better genetic material, or direct benefits, like better worms and food for your babies, nesting sites, or perhaps even freedom from sexually transmitted diseases. Gotcha. So these are all benefits to the chooser. And what that means is that beauty in nature is really another kind of utility. It's sort of a handmaiden of adaptation, continuing right along in a non-disruptive way with the general idea that natural selection is a strong force that dominates evolutionary process.
Okay, so the conventional wisdom is that a bird has really beautiful plumage. It's actually just a telegraph to the female of the species that he has better fitness.
Yeah,
somehow his offspring are going to thrive more, so you should pick me. My plumage is directly tied to that.
Yeah, that females should like redder because redder is better, and better is objectively true.
Yeah, in the sense that better means more healthier, fit offspring.
Yeah.
And so because of that, evolution will continue down a path where more and more fitness induces more of these adaptations. But you say that's not really the case, is it?
Yeah, well, I allow that those mechanisms are plausible and possible. The question is whether that's an accurate view of ornament in nature on the whole.
Sure.
And their alternative, of course, is that preferences evolve because they're popular. That is, it's sort of the biological equivalent of an irrationally exuberant market bubble where mere popularity drives the evolution of ornament. So the alternative is that the peacock's tail doesn't mean anything, but that preferences for the peacock's tail evolve because those females that choose attractive males will have attractive offspring. And that the preferences and trait co-evolve essentially with one another, producing an elaboration of the trait in the absence of meaning. And according to this idea, beauty in nature is arbitrary and also for its own sake. It isn't about utility. It isn't about objective improvement. It's about getting what you want. And that there is something, of course, this whole idea is based on the idea that there is something that animals want, that they have subjective experiences and desires that should be not explained away, but actually explained by the science itself.
Yeah, so I kind of see two aspects of this argument that I want to drill down into a little more deeply. Obviously, it's multifaceted. There are many aspects, but two that stand out to me. The first one being this kind of runaway this runaway morphology that gets, I mean, that verges on ridiculous. Like, we've all seen Planet Earth and how ludicrously incredible these birds of paradise can be. And I think the peacock obviously is a great example, so much so that it has found its way into the kind of human lexicon. Like, a guy is peacocking when he's really showing off, right? So there's that, which I think we should dive into first. And then, just so that I don't forget, you can help me stay honest, this second side, which I think is such an important point that's made in your book, which really is about beauty for the sake of beauty, attraction just because it's attractive, just because animals have subjective experience, they have preferences. It's crazy that we never gave them that credit before. So we'll dive into that, because that's a big part of the book. But the first thing, this idea of runaway morphology, is it safe for me to make a parallel in my mind between this and like island gigantism or island dwarfism? Is it a similar scenario where these specific traits continue to get selected and selected almost on a really windy branch that's not really leading anywhere, right? Because evolution doesn't really work like that. But it becomes ludicrous in and of itself, because it continues to evolve in kind of a very specific direction.
Right. Well, the mechanism of mate choice can lead to both rapid rate of evolution, but it also, over time and over species and over geography, it can lead to radiation differences among species, right? And so and populations, and so in the book, I propose the concept of an aesthetic radiation, to be contrasted directly with the traditional idea of adaptive radiation. So the Galapagos finches and lots of other examples.
Where you have multiple...
The cichlid fishes of Lake Tanganyika. These are all cases where you have a radiation in ecology space, or extreme numbers of species or extreme ecological diversity arising within a single group.
Yeah, so one particular species, or we should say common ancestor, leads to a bunch of technically different species, probably of the same genus, I would assume, similarly related.
Could happen at different levels.
Could
if
happen
you're
at
talking
different
orchids,
levels.
it's at a level of a family, right?
You're right. But they're obviously all related, yet they have such bizarre and extreme differences that you can say, without a shadow of the doubt, like Darwin's finches. They're all finches.
And
They've all got different beaks.
And adaptive radiation is interesting because it's a premier example of the strength of adaptation by natural selection to diversify from a common ancestral type, and that is, of course, fascinating to those interested in evolution. But I want to contrast that with a similar or related pattern, which is aesthetic radiation, where a group of birds like the birds of paradise or the bowerbirds or the manakins from South America and Central America that I study have radiated, but in an ornamental fashion. In a way that may or may not be actually related to adaptation at all.
Yeah, because
and that's where the where I hope the concept take hold, that evolution isn't always about improvement. It can be about popularity. It can be about that element of subjective experience.
Yeah. So when we take a step back and we really talk about evolution, right? Because I think there are so many misunderstandings out there about evolution. And I think the very first one that I come across a lot is this idea that evolution is in any way guided, that it's in any way goal-oriented, that anybody, any being, any mathematical equation exists to say eventually this organism will evolve to have these traits. We got to get that out of our minds, right? Evolution is...
And beauty is a powerful argument about that, because in essence, there are so many different varieties of ways to successfully seduce another mind. And that's really what's going on. And to be attractive requires being attractive in the way that is preferred in that species or in that context, right? And that means that there are a myriad of solutions to this challenge, and that is what nature really looks like. So if we're interested in understanding that there isn't a goal-oriented or teleology to evolutionary biology, beauty is an awesome aspect of that, because it's everywhere. You see different species have different solutions to what it means to be beautiful.
So then, to play devil's advocate for a moment, because I'm sure when you were first developing these hypotheses and you were first writing about them, you ran up against some resistance, both probably from the journal editors, from peers, from individuals who we like our conventional wisdom in science, right? It's hard to rock the boat in science. Would one of the arguments be that if beauty were not linked in any functional way to fitness, right? If it were just aesthetics for the sake of aesthetics, that somehow that would ultimately be the most powerful driving force for evolution? Because, I mean, mate selection trumps everything, doesn't it?
Well, interestingly here, we probably have to start to step back from a description of the problem to go toward the history of the problem.
Okay.
How do we get here? What is it? What led us to this kind of common understanding that ornament is a kind of utility? And indeed, yes, over my career, my papers in this area have gotten some blowback and, a difference of opinion from the mainstream. But these arguments are actually quite old. The idea of mate choice was proposed by Charles Darwin in a second book, a revolutionary book that I think is really underrated, Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And he proposed in that model an alternative or an additional hypothesis about evolutionary mechanism. And it was based on, instead of differential survival and fecundity or fertility of offspring, it was about differential mating and fertilization success. And he found two different mechanisms. One was male-male, or usually male-male competition within one sex for control over opportunities to mate with the opposite sex. And this mechanism, he proposed, would give rise to armaments like antlers, large body size, mechanisms of control, weapons.
Things, yeah. So you could fight off another male in order to mate.
In order to control opportunities to mate.
Sure. Become the alpha.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the alternative, or the additional mechanism, was mate choice, that is, evaluation by one sex of mates of the other with choice. And Darwin proposed this would give rise to ornament in nature.
And this is, of course, what we see in that classic Birds of Paradise example, like
right.
when you watch Planet
Peacock's
Earth,
tail.
and like you see these jungle birds doing these really intricate mating dances where they clear the forest and they build a pole and they show off these amazing colors, and it's borderline ludicrous, but it's all to get laid. Like that's what they're trying to do,
right? And so the interesting thing about Darwin's idea is that this is the creator of adaptation by natural selection. The origin of this idea was his, and he was proposing a different and actually distinct evolutionary mechanism.
Yeah.
Darwin thought of sexual selection as a distinct way of evolution. And his idea that male-male competition structured the natural world was a winner immediately in the Victorian era, right? It was adopted immediately because it so reflected the world as they saw it. And then additionally, I think it went a long way to forwarding the mission of having evolution be relevant to the world, to be reasonable. It reinforced the way people saw the world.
Which is, maybe was important at the time because it was a pretty out there idea, especially in an incredibly religiously conservative society. Right. So if it could catch on in any way, maybe that's the only way it could have catch on.
Unfortunately, sexism came in service of the advance of understanding evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
But the opposite idea, the idea that mate choice, in particular, that female mate choice and freedom of female mate choice was a force in the natural world, was a loser. Darwin's idea was criticized, and most especially by Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of the theory of adaptation by natural selection. So Wallace and Darwin debated over this, and they never agreed. But Wallace basically came to articulate the idea of honest advertisement, the idea that mate mating displays indicate mate quality.
I see.
He articulated that entirely back in the 1880s. But
And this
he
was before
called
we
it,
knew about genes, by the way.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And he called it a kind of natural selection. He said, so natural, of course, if it's adaptive, it's just about natural selection. So he got rid of the term. And then in the modern era, this same idea has become very, very popular in the last 30, 40 years. But people have rearranged it in a new non-Darwinian way. They think of sexual selection as a kind of natural selection, and that comes straight out of Wallace, not Darwin. So one of the aspects of the book is to try to disrupt the way people have been thinking about this by pointing out that, the mainstream theory of how ornament evolves is as virulently anti-Darwinian today as it was in the 1870s.
Well, and the truth is, in the 1870s, there was really no way to test this. I mean, you could do observation in the field, but you really couldn't look at the genes because, first of all, like I said, they didn't know genes existed. And you would have to make kind of, no, killer, getting excited. And you would have to, I guess, observe different traits that you thought of as having increased fitness and then see if they correlated with these beauty displays. But now we can actually look at the genome. We can actually see if organisms that have, beautiful plumage are conferring specific traits in a frequency that's better. Is this something people are testing?
Well, they are. Unfortunately, it's hard, right?
Yeah.
I mean, people are starting to look at genes for reproductive behavior in mammals, right? So different species or populations of mice or shrews that are either monogamous or polygynous, and they find and can actually identify genetic variations that are associated with those behaviors.
Okay.
But it's really hard. And one of the things is that the history of beauty is a tree. It's about the tree of life, right? So what the aesthetic repertoire, all of the things that are attractive in a particular species aren't just understandable in terms of that one population today. That repertoire has evolved over the history of life among species and genera over time, right? So that's promising, but I think that's going to be all there. We're still going to have to do comparative biology, phylogenetics in order to understand the evolution of ornament.
I guess, what is the state of that research, though, in individuals who are interested in answering this question? Because it does seem like the argument that's laid out here is one of, and I guess correct me if I'm wrong, that there is evolution via natural selection by fitness, in the purest sense of the term, improved ability to pass on your offspring, healthier genes, whatever that may be.
Well, let's unpack fitness because that's where that's coming. So it turns out that this is a really problematic word.
Okay.
And as an evolutionary biologist, it's actually kind of troubling that this word is so screwed up.
Okay.
Because to Darwin, fitness meant physically fit.
Oh, interesting. I never even think of that word as meaning physically
right,
fit.
Exactly. It was about a property of the individual to do something that would further their survival or fecundity.
Yeah, like I am strong.
Right, and therefore I survive, right?
Yeah.
So, but then in the thoroughly Wallacean early 20th century, as population genetics was being developed, fitness was redefined to mean the relative frequency of certain genes, your genes, in the population in the next generation or in future generations.
And how fit they are with...
And that became a mathematical concept, an abstract concept.
Yes.
And that's okay. The problem was that this now abstract concept kept its romantic association with the concept of adaptation by natural selection. And that was because at that point, everybody had followed Wallace to think that sexual selection was irrelevant, that this was a terrible idea, that it was out. And so what the idea of the mathematical concept of fitness did was to combine survival, fecundity with differential mating success, differential fertilization.
And that's how I think of it.
And flatten the world. So in the book, I propose that it's actually impossible to be authentically Darwinian with modern vocabulary.
Okay.
And this was done with an intellectual mission, right? The mission was to suppress the aesthetic perspective, to suppress the idea that there could be a second selective force in which the animals were agents in their own evolution, that their own pleasure was driving evolution, because this was anathema to the Wallace's worldview of adaptation as a strong force that structures the world. And we're still living in a Wallacean world, not in a Darwinian world. And part of my mission is to try to make people think about that problem.
And you don't think with sufficient enough kind of paradigm shift, a movement towards a more Darwinian view, that the concept of fitness could still survive, but that this aesthetic type of competition could not just work itself into that definition, this kind of umbrella definition?
It's kind of like political rhetoric.
Okay.
When one party, to the other party's annoyance, redefines a phrase or a term that you're boxed in and they got you trapped. You can't even articulate what it is that's so screwed up because they are running the vocabulary, right?
Sure.
And what's the solution there? The solution there is to either burn it down or to try to transform that vocabulary in a way where that old structure no longer exists.
And what's your preference?
That's the hope of the book.
Yeah.
Right. So what I'm proposing, back to Evolution 101, is that at the microevolutionary level, there's 5 mechanisms: mutation, recombination, drift, natural selection, and sexual selection.
Okay.
And that the adaptationist or the adaptive mate choice or even adaptive male-male competition is a consequence of the interaction of natural and sexual selection. So I'm not trying to make it impossible.
And you're not trying to make it binary. Like, they both have an effect.
Right. But by defining sexual selection as distinct and abandoning or at least my solution is I just don't use the word fitness anymore.
Interesting.
It's out of my vocabulary.
It's such a hard one to break.
Well, the problem is that it comes with intellectual baggage.
It's loaded.
Which is there's a lot of baggage, like eugenics, right?
Yeah.
Comes straight out of that era.
We actually talk about that a little bit on the show whenever we talk about religion and about atheism, and this idea that God with a big G, it has so much baggage that when people try to talk about God with a little g, it's so Christianified. It's very difficult to get away from, like a new definition of God. It's like, come up with a new word, because like we all know what people think of when they think of God. And so trying to use it in a new way can be difficult, right?
Yeah,
because it carries baggage.
I'm just not using the word fitness a lot.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna try.
Yeah, you got back to back.
You can point it out if I accidentally use it. It's so central to my vocabulary. But when we talk about so that's good, because that answered another question that I had about this theory. I mean, we'll call it a theory, right? Or I guess a sub-theory, which is selection via aesthetic choice.
Yeah.
Selection via mate preference, and having nothing to do with genetic fitness, as I just said, but having everything to do with choice about beauty, choice about preference.
But the important thing, again, this is why we're trapped, because in fact, the preferences in most of these birds are genetic. Right, they're inherited. Yeah. They're genetic. They're evolving.
They don't make
because
these
they're
choices.
Popular, right? Yeah. They're evolving because females who choose certain displays are going to be rewarded by having more grandkids because their offspring will be sexually attractive to other females.
That's true.
And that will drive the evolution of their preferences as well as the traits they're selecting on. So the mechanism really is about how mate choice creates a kind of self-organizing process where the agent of the origin or the agent of the evolution of preference is preference itself. Its popularity is what's driving the diversification of ornament in the natural world. In the book, I propose that a slogan for this is "Beauty happens." When you have sensory perception, cognitive evaluation, and social opportunity for choice, the result is beauty happening. The evolution of traits and preference, the coevolution of traits and preference that will self-organize the population.
And that's, of course, why birds are such a beautiful example of this, right? And the fact that anybody could look at it and say birds have no preference and they have no decision-making capacity blows my mind.
Well, most of my colleagues are saying they have preferences. They're just saying that the range and diversity of those preferences, the evolution of preference is going to be regulated by adaptation by
Okay.
by this other force. One way to look at it, an analogy I use in the book, is to compare the origin of the value of beauty to the value of money.
Okay.
Right? Under the gold standard, which is the original source of the value of the dollar, a dollar had value because it stood in lieu of a tiny piece of gold in Fort Knox.
Mm-hmm.
You could actually go and turn in your dollars and get gold for them, right? Don't ask why gold's valuable, right? Because that's
it's
ridiculous.
Another
that's a whole
conversation.
right? But anyway, so modern money exists without gold.
That's true.
Right? It's suspended.
contract.
It's suspended on our what Paul Samuelson called a social contrivance.
Mm-hmm.
So the value of money, every currency on the planet, including Bitcoin, is driven by some agreement among some population to say, you know what, this is convenient. This thing has value. We're going to use it.
Yeah.
There's no longer any gold. So under the gold standard, the value of money is extrinsic. It's outside the money. It's the gold. And under the new money, the value of the money is money itself.
Yeah.
Right? So most of my colleagues are on the gold standard.
I see.
The peacock's tail has value to them because it stands in lieu of something else. And that something else is good genes or better babies or some objective improvement. Right? And I'm, and Darwin and I are basically proposing that, beauty is like money, is just popular. Right? And it's driven by a social contract. But that social contract in the case of birds is mostly genetical. And so there's a lot of population genetic theory coming from guys like Fisher and Landy and Kirkpatrick that create mathematical machinery that show how beauty happens, how it can self-organize in the population merely as a result of popularity.
Simply because of that one variable, taking the other variables out. And that's really the question is, how do you scientifically investigate this theory?
Well, so my proposal is to say, let's imagine you see a rainbow, right? And you ask yourself, is the value of the rainbow intrinsic to the rainbow, or is it extrinsic, right? And the leprechaun tail is actually about an extrinsic value to the rainbow, because at the end of the rainbow, there's a pot of gold.
Yeah.
Right? And so the null hypothesis is there a pot of gold at the end of there? What's the null? Well, of course, if a leprechaun comes up and says, hey, there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, do you believe him? I say no.
Yeah.
Of course you don't believe him. Show me the money. The burden of proof is on the leprechaun. Mm-hmm. And I think that likewise, when you propose that the peacock's tail is somehow associated with some extrinsic value, the burden of proof is on those who would propose this extraordinary connection between variation in appearance and variation in some kind of objective attribute of quality, right? And so in the book, which articulates a proposal I made back in 2010, I proposed that the beauty happens idea, the Darwinian model, is the null, right? Our expectation is that beauty is just stuff happening, except the stuff that's happening is beautiful, right? And that the extraordinary hypothesis is the one that would propose this elaborate connection between beauty and some kind of extrinsic factor. And that's not popular because most people got into the business thinking that their job was to show the power of natural selection in shaping the world. Mm-hmm. And this is a way in which a huge aspect of the world is it's off the ranch. It's not under the control of adaptation, and that's irritating to lots of biologists. But I think it's a theory that's much closer to describing the world as it is.
The problem is when we state that the burden of proof is on these individuals to show the relationship between aesthetics or beauty and some sort of trait that has adaptive benefit. It's one thing to say that they have the burden of proof. It's another thing in practice to know that that's where the conventional wisdom lies.
Unfortunately, right now, people are so convinced of the importance of adaptation and natural selection that every ornament in nature is hypothesized to be related to some benefit.
But is there any evidence to support that?
Sure, there are some. There are some good examples. But what happens in people's research programs is that they think their job is to find it. And so if they haven't found it, they merely conclude that they haven't looked hard enough. And they actually never reject the idea that beauty
maybe
is
there
adaptive.
is no relationship.
Right?
Yeah.
And so as a result, this is kind of a faith-based empirical research program based on the concept of adaptationism, which comes straight out of Wallace.
Yeah, it's like you're looking for something. the whole time. You're like on a mission to.
Well, not only that, but if you don't find it, you conclude you haven't looked hard enough.
Exactly.
Which means
so
that
anti-scientific.
it is not science.
Yeah.
You have to have, as we've seen from genetics, right? In genetics, we have neutral theory to show whether or not drift or selection is responsible for the cause, the maintenance of genetic variation, and then in community ecology, we have null models of community assembly. If you want to know why there's so many species of birds on the Channel Islands out here, you have to ask, what would be, is that community structured by competition, or is it merely just stuff happening? A bunch of birds flying out to the Channel Islands, right? And so you have to use null models there. And sexual selection is just another area. And that's why I know, this is going to work. There will be a null model revolution in sexual selection. You cannot have a science based on the assumption that adaptation is occurring. And that you're looking at it, and your job is to find it. That's not science, and that's why that's one of the reasons to write the book.
Yeah, it's such a blatant example of confirmation bias, right? It's kind of the whole point of science is to try to eliminate these types of biases from the equation, and to be able to look at things that are objectively testable.
And one of the perverse parts about it is that it ends up leading to I think an impoverished view of the natural world, which actually is not doing such a great job of describing the world.
Yeah, ignoring this beautiful, I guess is a good descriptor, pull that is beauty.
Yeah.
And so I think one thing that's so beautiful about this, and I think it's funny too that I'm having you on the show in the middle of a string of female scientists. I've had many female scientists on before and will after you, is that this book really in many ways gives the power back to the female of the species, when historically I think the power was always there. I just think scientists didn't really nod to it very readily. And so it really is a great example of the fact that science is done by people, and people have bias, don't they?
Absolutely. And what's fascinating about the aesthetic view is that when you realize that individual animals are making choices based on explicitly on what they like, what they want, then suddenly there's an agency there. There is an agent who is actually involved in and in aggregate driving the evolution of the species. So the aesthetic view shows or proposes that birds are agents in their own evolution, birds themselves. Mm-hmm. But under the adaptive view, we've already explained that away.
It's just nature.
We know everything they do is about confirming and getting better and objective. So there's no agency there. You already have an elaborate theory that explains them away.
They just passively go through these decision-making processes as if they don't have another choice because nature tells them otherwise.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting about that leads to the next portion of the book, which is really about what happens when aesthetic agency is infringed by sexual coercion or sexual violence.
Which is quite common in the animal kingdom.
It is. Yeah. It is. I mean, sexual conflict is really this whole area of where the interests of males and females differ in the context of reproduction. And there's lots of areas in which you can have conflict. But in particular, part of that is conflict over copulation, over mating, over who mates with who and how much and how frequently and when, right? And so that leads to a lot of sexual coercion and even sexual violence in the natural world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess a sort of liberal progressive feminist who maybe has no context and then goes into biology blind. Maybe they'd sign up to be a field biologist and they go out and they just start watching animals mate in nature, might say, God, they're all getting raped. It really seems that way to the outside view. And of course, I don't think we often use that term in a biological, it's a very human convention.
It's really interesting and still problematic, but it's something I grapple with in the book. And that's the fact that, a large part of my research program over the last 10 years has been a collaboration with Patricia Brennan, now was a postdoc in my lab and now at Mount Holyoke College, working on duck sex and the evolution of duck genitalia, investigating or exploring sexual conflict in ducks.
The corkscrew penis.
Yes. Yeah. So that's our work, and Patty and our and the other collaborators, right? And that there's a lot of forced copulation in ducks. And forced copulation is exactly what you mentioned, violent, and is against, the females resist and are often harmed and even killed in the process.
So
in some cases, it's actually socially organized into kind of gang rape, right?
Yeah.
Which is like very difficult. Interestingly, when Susan Brownmiller published, Against Our Will in the 1970s, biologists abandoned the use of the word rape in biology.
Interesting.
And of course, this was very legitimate at the time to recognize the special political, social context of sexual intimidation and sexual violence in humans, right? Unfortunately, one of the downsides of this is that the use of the word forced copulation and the adaptationist paradigm that these things are about objective betterment has really erased the fact that forced copulation in nature can be against the will of the ducks.
It really sanitizes it, doesn't it? Just,
and it has sanitized it, and the aesthetic has been the connection to this, because once you recognize the agency of individual female ducks, then you have a new kind of way of conceptualizing what happens when they don't get what they want, when they're infringed by violence. And that's directly led to this work on duck sex, which frankly has transformed my view of the evolution of beauty in a new and totally unexpected way.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I think it just points to another, not to get political, but another example of why it's so important to have many different people from different walks of life engaged in this type of research.
Well, let's get political.
You lack that perspective.
Let's get political, because the fact of the matter is that evolutionary biology is thoroughly political. And it's and one aspect of politics is to say, you know what, we're not political here.
Yeah.
Right?
Biologists love to do that.
Yeah, and that's what the Victorians did when they said,
scientists in general.
Right,
love
in
to
general.
Do
That's untenable. You have to examine your own assumptions, your own perspective, your own frame, your own identity, and understand how it influences the science you do.
Absolutely. And when you look at a field, and I mean, I think I can say this without any question, every field of science up to a certain point was dominated by men. We are starting to see a shift, especially in the biological sciences and the social sciences, where we have more women involved than men in certain fields. But that doesn't erase the history of research, right? It doesn't erase the body of knowledge that we're building on top of. And when there were no women in the room when these original studies were being conducted, it's not to say that men don't have the capability to empathize, but you have a female perspective. Let's say a male scientist, a female scientist are watching forced copulation. It just seems more likely the more women are involved, the more that they might say, looks like she's not really enjoying that. I don't know. There's something about that makes me a little uncomfortable.
One of the things about this research, though, is that it has I think establishes a totally new connection between essentially feminism and evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
What we've discovered in ducks, for example, is that freedom of choice matters to ducks. That there is an evolutionary consequence to getting what you want, right? The way it works, and so the duck sex in a nutshell is that they pair up, but as the eggs are being laid, a number of other additional males will attempt a forced copulation with the female. And ducks are also one of the unusual and limited number of birds that still have a penis. And the penis is fascinating and weird. It has lymphatic erection. It's corkscrew shaped. It doesn't have a urethra. It has a sulcus, just a groove on the outside. And erection is explosive, occurs in less than half a second, and then ejaculation takes place and it's over, right? So intromission, entry into the female, and erection of the penis are the same thing. So what we've discovered or what Patty discovered really, is that co-evolving with this penis is a complicated vaginal morphology that excludes the penis during forced copulation. So what that Tea Party Senate candidate Todd Akin said about rape, that women have a way of just shutting that whole thing down, is true
in ducks.
of ducks, but in a way that informs something deeply interesting about sexual autonomy, which is that the capacity to reinforce female freedom of choice can evolve. The way it evolves is when the female duck gets the male she likes with the green head and the quack, quack, quack that she really likes, then her offspring will inherit those genes for those traits that she likes that other females have also evolved to prefer. But if she's forcibly fertilized by forced copulation, then her offspring will inherit either a random trait from this random male or an inferior trait that she has explicitly rejected, which means that her offspring are not going to be as sexually attractive to other females. So in this case, it's the normativity, it's the evolved agreement among females about what is attractive that provides females with the leverage to advance their own freedom of choice in the face of sexual violence. So those females that have the right mutation that gives rise to a more convoluted reproductive tract that excludes the penis during forced copulation will advance because they will have more freedom of choice, which means more sons that other females like. They'll be rewarded by other females, and that is a fundamentally feminist discovery. It doesn't have anything to do with the number of females in science. It's just saying, you know what, sexual autonomy is not a legal concept invented by suffragettes and feminists. It's an evolved feature of social sexual species.
Absolutely. It's default. It's there. It's absolutely there. It's as central to being male and female as you can get. And I just want to make sure that we clarify the mechanism by which the female can basically have that choice and say, I don't want the forced copulation to fertilize. I mean, like in human beings, we don't often have that choice, but ducks do.
Yeah, it's a unique situation. So what
relaxing, right?
So what happens is that in fact the complexity of the vagina has either dead end cul-de-sacs, like literally side pockets, and then above those it has a clockwise coil, which is an anti-sense chirality to the penis.
It's the opposite twisty.
Yeah. So it's an anti-screw device, right? And so during a solicited copulation, the female can relax those muscles, and intromission or entry of the penis is permitted completely. So they can control this. And it turns out in some species where 40-50% of copulations are forced, only 2 to 5% of the offspring in the nest are from extra pair copulations.
Oh, wow. So it's really successful.
So they're 98% successful at preventing fertilization. So that's like an FDA approvable birth control method, deployable in your reproductive tract. And
by choice.
How does that evolve?
Yeah.
And that it evolves because there is a reward to females from other females by getting what you want.
Yeah.
And so this is really about a kind of sisterhood.
If only they could evolve a way to not be forced upon to begin with, right? That's really the trouble there. The trauma.
The ducks are in an arms race, and it's not great. I mean, advances in penis complexity lead to countermeasures in vaginal complexity, but it just keeps going on and on. The only way to break that is to have kind of ecological situations where you don't get lots of density and then not a lot of opportunity. But interestingly, there are other birds that pursue alternatives. And one of them is the bowerbird, which is I discuss at length in the book. And the bowerbird is a polygynous bird where the females do all the nesting. They build the nest, lay the eggs, raise the young, etc. But they visit among available different males and choose their mates. And the males build this courtship display structure called a bower. It looks like a nest, but it's not a nest at all. It's really kind of a seduction theater, if you will. It's a stage for this display process to take place. And it has this beautiful architecture, and it's decorated with all these found objects. It's pretty nuts. So the interesting thing about the bower is that in addition to being beautiful and being kind of architecture, it also creates a protected niche for the female, physical protection. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the avenue bower has 2 walls, parallel walls, and with a spot in the middle. And so the female sits in there, and the male displays in front of her with all his stuff, whether it's shells or feathers or berries or flowers, right? But in order to copulate, he has to go around the back of the bower because she's surrounded by these walls. And that gives her an opportunity to pop out the front if she doesn't like what she's getting.
So it really is consensual.
So it's, for her, it's really like protection from date rape.
Yeah.
She can be as intimate as she wants, literally an inch away from this guy and all of his stuff, and completely maintain her freedom of choice. So I call this aesthetic remodeling because it's a deployment of mate choice to transform maleness and male display in a way that fulfill female aesthetic desires, but also protect the female from losing her autonomy, losing her freedom of choice.
Yeah. And it is so interesting that so many examples within the animal kingdom are examples where it is the female that does the selecting. And we see that the female might have the more drab coloring. They don't end up with these peacockian displays. It's the males of the species that are vying for female attention. It really is empowering but so obvious, right? And it makes you frustrated. Like, how did the research historically manage, even when it's so obvious that females had the choice, manage to not tell that story?
Well, there's a whole nother layer. We've been talking a long time about how traits and preferences evolve and co-evolve, and that selection. There's a whole nother layer to this story, which is the ecological context of reproduction. What do they eat? What's the habitat like? What's the territories? And that's a whole richness. And indeed, they're just birds that vary in opportunities for choice, right? And if you don't have, for example, most birds have two parents attending the nest.
Okay.
And so that takes a lot of work. So that means the difference between the most sexually successful and the least sexually successful birds are not that large. So that means the strength of sexual selection is not going to be extreme. In these birds of paradise and bowerbirds, the sexual selection is so strong because you have some males that are enormously successful and others that are not. Actually, in a lot of these polygynous birds, these aesthetic extremists, as I call them, the distribution of sexual success is a lot like the income distribution. You have like 5% of the males getting 50% of the copulations, another 10% getting mopping up, and then you got, in many cases, 50% of the males that will never mate in their lives. Right? So this is extreme, but the result of that is extreme aesthetic elaboration.
Yeah.
So there are, of course, birds where the female is brighter. The female is larger. She sings the songs. Usually it's a kind of what we call territorial polyandry, where the female has a territory, and if it's good, she can attract multiple males. She lays eggs, they build the nest, and they care for the young. So these include things like jacanas, or these shorebirds with long toes that walk on lily pads, that live in the tropical areas of the world, and various other kinds of weird shorebirds. So it's a minority, but there are these cases where indeed the female is brighter and choice is male choice.
And it is funny how when it comes to biology, or I should say in science in general, maybe not certain aspects of physics, but most science in general, I used to always tell my students, if the question says always in it, the answer is probably false. we can generally come up with an exception to the rule. Just
Indeed.
a quick and dirty there. So we are running low on time, which bums me out because there's so much more to cover. But I do want to ask one more question before we get to our final two. And that is, of course, I think the ever selfish question that I'm sure you run up against all the time, which is, how does this relate to me? How, because it's hard, right? It's hard to sometimes take what we know about evolution in the animal kingdom, even though we are animals, we are apes. We know that we are victim to evolutionary pressures. We know that evolution is still taking place within humans, yet we have culture and we have cognition and we have intellect and language, and we can in many ways trump all the rules, no pun intended, by just choosing to go against our quote unquote very nature. So where does the story of us come into this conversation about the evolution of beauty?
Well, it basically the last third of the book is about the evolution of human sexuality. Indeed, the evolution of humans. And it, so little has been done from the aesthetic perspective that there's just a lot of richness there. And I think a lot of productive ideas. It turns out in talking about human evolution, the ideas of or the mechanisms of adaptation by natural selection on ecology and male-male sexual competition have both been around a lot. But the idea of female choice and female mate choice as having much relevance hasn't really been a part of the human evolution story recently. And so I'm proposing that it is and needs to be and should be. But of course, you're right. It's complicated.
But it's obvious too that it has to be at least be part of the conversation.
It turns out that humans are difficult because every possible mechanism of sexual selection, sexual conflicts occurring at the same time. So we have male-male competition, female-female competition, male mate choice, female mate choice, sexual conflict based on male coercion and female coercion. And then on top of that, you got culture, which can either parallel those mechanisms or go in a whole different direction, right?
And we also have technology, so we can in some ways kind of skew or cover some of these natural features,
Material
right?
culture
put makeup on and then all of a sudden you're more attractive.
Plastic surgery.
Put on high heels. Exactly.
Right.
Or like just take medicine and now or wear glasses, now you can see again.
Right. So I dive right into that but it's important to do. And one thing is that this honest advertisement or adaptive mate choice idea has really permeated the culture so deeply that I think even teenagers grow up thinking that their facial asymmetries or their personal idiosyncrasies are just announcing their inferior genetic quality, right?
They don't look like the person on the magazine,
right? Yeah. And that this is about objective truth, right?
Yeah.
So the adaptationist view, I think, has really had a corrosive impact on people,
on mental health.
And so what I would love to have one of the impacts of this book be this growing awareness that, for example, for teenagers, that sexual development is not just about becoming a sexual object, but growing into being a sexual subject with one's own desires and needs to figure out, and the responsibility and the freedom to do it, and to know that part of the equation has been deeply important in human history, right? And that so it's part of like realizing our human history to be and celebrate one's subjectivity. What is it that we like?
Yeah, and the fact that the female orgasm probably persists just because it feels good, not because it improves our ability to make babies.
I go quite a bit further in proposing that that the female orgasm is both the proximate product and the evolutionary consequence of females getting what they want. That in this case, it's female agency that has driven the evolution of human female sexual pleasure beyond what it was in our ape relatives.
I love it. All right. So, Rick, I want to close by asking you the same two questions. I ask them to every guest on the show. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. These are some big picture questions. And they are, when you think about the future, in whatever context is relevant to you as you sit here right now, it could be your own personal future, the future of your work, the future of biology, the future of humanity. Number one, what is the thing that kind of keeps you up the most at night? The thing you're most concerned about, worried about, a bit pessimistic about when you look to the future? But then on the flip side of that, so we don't end on a bummer note, what are you most hopeful and optimistic for? What do you look forward to?
Yeah. The interesting thing is the way in which those worries are so detached from my own work. My work as an ornithologist is a passion project. I mean, I started bird watching at the age of 10, and I never considered doing anything else. So here I am. I think I'm decades in, and it's maybe not unlikely that this intellectual project doesn't solve or contribute to global warming or conservation, right? So obviously, I think, planetary degradation of the climate and extinction through, habitat use ongoing, don't worry about what's going to happen to the ocean in 100 years. Just what we're doing now this week in the planet is having a huge impact, right? Those two things are obviously my biggest concern.
Yeah.
And, sadly, although I never thought I would be talking about, the evolution of orgasm or the origin of the human species, topics that are really important and interesting and relevant to us, it's not yet relevant to conservation or to those questions. I guess what I'm really excited about now is, I'm a hardcore scientist, but getting into aesthetics has led me to really question the boundaries of science and say, really, where we're headed is a world in which we don't wall off science from other ways of knowing. We just talk about quality of ways of knowing. Right. Mm-hmm. And that, science shouldn't enshrine hypothesis testing as, I think, it's the one thing that we have that other people don't have. It's like science works because it's good.
Yeah.
Right. And so we shouldn't be worried about that. And in essence, what I'm working on now is a view of aesthetics that starts at one end of the spectrum as pure hard science, and the other end has zero science involved. And yet, the art museum and literature and art criticism, but is actually seamlessly interconnected and woven into like one intellectual project. I see that as well happening between evolutionary biology and feminism, gender studies, queer theory, right? Where currently people who are antagonistic or misunderstanding can be not just on the same page, but part of this common intellectual tapestry, mm-hmm. right? So that gives me hope in this area, and despite the dumbing down of the public discourse, the brilliance of young people, their passion, the students I meet are totally inspiring. So they're going to be people firing on all cylinders, and ones I can't even imagine in future generations, and that gives me a lot of hope.
I second that. I am endlessly impressed when I meet young people and how their access to technology, their ability to read things that were harder to get a hold of when we were children, their ability to build upon previous knowledge at such a young age and connect knowledge in a way that we were incapable of doing, has just set them free. I mean, I am so impressed by the minds of these young people competing in nationwide science fairs or international science fairs. You're 9 years old and you came up, okay, I think we're gonna be okay. So yeah, I definitely second that notion. Well, Rick. Actually, I should say, everybody listening, the book is The Evolution of Beauty, How Darwin's Forgotten Theory of Mate Choice Shapes the Animal World and Us by Dr. Richard O. Prum. It's available anywhere you buy books now. And Rick, why don't you let everybody know kind of where they can find you? Are you active on social media, or do you have a website where you like to post, or, where can they find your work?
Yeah, I just joined Facebook about 10 days ago.
Good for you.
And my students have said, Rick, you cannot join Twitter, because I've kept my stuff together today, but they consider me to be kind of intellectually incontinent, the kind of person that would say outrageous stuff on Twitter. So they were going to actually start one for me, and they were going to call it Shit Rick Says.
Yeah.
That hasn't happened yet, but they would be like my little firewall. So that
that's almost a better idea than basically I think we all learned that when Richard Dawkins had his own Twitter account, that it became quite dangerous. Maybe he should have students who are filtering what he says. Oh, that's hilarious. So you are on Facebook, so people can find you there.
Yeah, you can find my book on Facebook, and other than that, you can find, I have a website at Yale, and you can find actually publications of my scientific publications and access to lots of work on biology there.
Very cool. So you guys go ahead and do that. Rick, thank you so much for joining me today. It was an absolute pleasure.
What a fun. It's really been great. Thank you.
Really was. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.